Everyone in Dry Fork said Greta Halverson would not last one season, and the men outside the feed store said it loudest the morning she came down the road leading a sick goat on a rope. She was 23 years old, a widow of 4 months, with $9 knotted into the hem of her apron and a wagon that held everything she owned in the world, and the goat behind her was so thin you could count its ribs through its dull brown hide. The animal stumbled. Greta stopped, waited for it, and went on. The men laughed. "Look there," said Cole Ander, who ran the freight line and never missed a chance to be heard. "The German widow's gone and bought herself a dead goat." "It ain't dead yet," said someone else. "Give it a week," Cole said, and the men laughed again, and Greta walked past them down the main street of Dry Fork, Colorado, in the dry, hot light of an August morning in 1884, and she did not turn her head. Before I tell you what that goat became and what Greta Halverson became, do me a small kindness. If you like stories about people the whole world counted out, give this video a like and leave me a comment telling me what city or town you are watching from. I read every one of them, and it means more than you know. Now, let me take you back to that dusty road, because the men outside the feed store were wrong about almost everything, and it would take them 3 years to admit it. The goat's name was Nothing Yet. Greta had not named it. She had found it the day before in the back lot behind Pruitt's stockyard, lying in the shade of a broken wagon, abandoned because it was sick, and a sick animal was worth less than the bullet to put it down. The hired man at the yard had told her she could have it for nothing if she hauled it off, because he did not want to dig the hole. Greta had crouched in the dust beside the animal and put her hand flat on its side and felt the fast, shallow breathing, and she had looked at the crusted eyes and the swollen jaw, and she had known, the way her mother had known these things back in the old country, that this was not a dying animal. This was a sick one. There is a difference, and the difference is everything, and almost nobody on the frontier bothered to learn it. So she paid nothing for the goat, and she led it home, and the men laughed. Home was 40 acres of broken ground 3 miles south of town. A homestead claim her husband Aldous had filed a year before he died of a fever that took him in 2 days and left her with a half-built soddy, a team of 2 oxen, a milk cow gone dry, and the $9. The land was bad. Everyone said so. It was high and stony, and the well her husband had dug went dry in July, and the only water now was a thin spring that came up cold from the foot of a red sandstone ledge and ran maybe a barrel an hour before it sank back into the gravel. The grass was poor, buffalo grass and grama in the swales, but up on the stony benches there was nothing a cow would touch, just scrub oak and snakeweed and a low gray brush the Mexicans called chamiso. A cow looks at that ground and starves. Greta had spent 4 months looking at that ground, and she had not figured out what to do with it, and the $9 was all that stood between her and the road back east, where her sister in Iowa had written that she could come and be a burden in a crowded house. $9. Keep that number. I am going to make you watch it shrink. She got the goat home as the sun went down. She made it a bed of clean straw in the lean-to against the soddy, out of the wind, and she boiled water and made a poultice of bread and warm milk from the 1 quart she had left, and she opened the swollen jaw with her thumb the way you would not believe a thin woman could, and she found the trouble. A sliver of bone or a thorn lodged up in the cheek, gone septic, She drew it out with a darning needle she had sterilized in the lamp flame, and the goat screamed and kicked, and Greta held it down with her knee and her whole weight and her teeth set, and when the thorn came free, a gout of foul matter came with it, and the goat went quiet and trembling, and Greta sat back in the straw with the thing in her fingers and looked at it in the lamplight. "There," she said. It was the first word she had spoken aloud in 2 days. "There! Now you will live or you will not, but it will not be that thing that kills you." She cleaned the wound with salt water. She held the goat's head in her lap until the sun came up, and in the morning the animal lifted its head on its own and looked at her, and the milky crust was gone from one eye, and Greta Halvorsen, who had not cried at her own husband's grave because there had been work to do, put her face down into the dirty hide of a worthless goat and wept until she had no more in her. Then she got up because there was work to do. The goat lived. By the 3rd day it was standing. By the 5th it was eating. First the soft bread mash, and then, to Greta's surprise, the gray chamiso brush from the stony bench, the brush a cow would not touch, the brush that grew thick and free on the worst of her bad 40 acres. She watched the goat go up the slope on its own thin legs and start to browse the scrub oak and the snakeweed tips and the bitter brush, picking and choosing, eating the very things that made her land worthless. And something turned over in Greta's mind, slow and quiet, the way a key turns in a stiff lock. A cow needs grass. A cow looks at a stony brush hillside and starves. But a goat is not a cow. A goat is a browser, not a grazer. It eats up, not down. It wants leaves and twigs and brush and the bitter woody things, and it climbs to get them, and it thrives on exactly the ground that ruins a cattleman. Greta had grown up in a mountain valley in Norway where the families too poor for cows kept goats on the steep, rocky ground above the fjord, and the goats gave milk and cheese and meat and skins to people who had nothing else, and she had milked them as a girl with her own cold hands before light. And she had forgotten, in the long, flat dream of coming to America to be a wife on good bottom land, that she knew how to do this. She had married a man who wanted to grow wheat. Aldous had wanted to grow wheat on 40 acres of stone, because wheat was what an American man grew, and the wheat had failed, and the well had failed, and then Aldous had failed too, and died, and left her here. But she was not Aldous. She looked at her bad land in a new way that 5th morning, and her bad land looked back at her, and it was not bad at all. It was a mountainside. It was the mountainside above the fjord, only browner and hotter and a long way from home. And on a mountainside you do not keep cows. You keep goats. She named the goat that morning. She called it Saga, which in her language is a story, the long kind, the kind that goes on through winters. Saga the goat. She would tell people years later that the whole empire began with a name spoken to a thin animal in a lean-to, and they would think she was being sentimental, and she was not. She was being exact. A thing you have not named, you can let die. A thing you have named, you will get up in the night for. Now, I want to be honest with you about how slow this was, because the frontier was not a place where good ideas paid off quickly. And Greta did not walk down to Dry Fork the next week and make the men eat their words. It took years. It took the $9 going to 4, and the 4 going to almost nothing, and a winter so hard it nearly broke her, and a man who tried to take it all, and a secret buried under the red sandstone ledge that she did not even know was there. Let me take you through it the way she lived it, day by day, because that is the only way you will understand how a sick goat that nobody would dig a hole for us built the largest dairy on the western slope of Colorado and made the name Halverson a thing people said with their hats off. One goat is not a herd. Greta knew that better than anyone. One goat, even a well goat, gives you nothing but a little milk and a lot of opinions. She needed more, and she had $9, which by then was $8, because she had spent $1 on salt and cornmeal in town, walking in and out past Cole Lander's freight office with her chin up and her eyes forward. So she went to find more goats, and here is where the frontier handed her a gift it did not know it was giving. Nobody wanted goats. In 1884, in the cattle country of western Colorado, a goat was a joke, a Mexican animal, a poor man's animal, a thing that got into your garden and stood on your wagon and ate your wife's wash off the line. The big ranchers ran cattle, and a few ran sheep, and they all despised goats. And so when an animal turned up sick or old or orphaned or just unwanted, nobody bought it. They abandoned it, the way Pruitt's man had abandoned Saga. And Greta Halverson made it known quietly at the back doors of the stockyards and along the freight road and through the Mexican families who lived south of town and kept a few goats of their own, that the German widow would take any goat nobody wanted, sick ones, old ones, orphan kids whose mothers had died. She would take them off your hands for nothing, or for a dime, or for a day's wash done. Let me show you one of those acquisitions, because they were not all the same, and one of them mattered more than Greta knew at the time. There was a Phelan outfit east of town, a man named Del Surratt, who had bought a few novelty goats off a passing drover 2 years back, meaning to amuse his children. And the goats had gotten into everything, and the children had grown bored, and now Surratt wanted them gone. Greta walked out to his place one September evening, and Surratt met her at his gate, half drunk and laughing before she even spoke. "Heard the German widows collecting goats," he said. "Come for mine? Take 'em. Take the whole cussed lot. They ruined my wife's garden twice. 4 of 'em. They ain't worth a thing, mind. 2's gone poorly." He spat. "You're welcome to walk a mile out here to haul off 4 worthless goats, lady, if that's how you want to spend an evening." "I will give you a dime apiece," Greta said. 40 cents for the 4. Surratt laughed so hard he had to hold the gate. 40 cents? For goats I'd have shot in a month? Lady, you have got to be the simplest creature ever come west. But he took the 40 cents because 40 cents was 40 cents, and he watched her tie the 4 poor animals in a string and lead them off down his road in the dusk, still laughing, and he told the story in town for a week. The simple German widow who paid money for his garbage goats. And 2 of those 4 goats, the 2 that were gone poorly, the 2 Surratt would have shot, grew the white curling silk, and one of them became the founding doe of a line that, 10 years on, threw the finest mohair fleeces in the state of Colorado. 40 cents. Del Surratt sold the foundation of an empire for 40 cents and laughed while he did it, and he was not the last man in this story to do exactly that. They came. Lord, they came. By the end of that first September, she had 11 goats, and she had paid out exactly $1.40 for the lot of them, and 3 of the 11 were so sick she did not expect them to live. $8 to $6 in change in her apron hem, and the men in town heard about it and laughed harder than ever, because now the German widow had a whole yard full of dying goats, and everybody knew where that was headed. "She's collecting carcasses," Colander said in the feed store, loud for the room. "Buying up every broke-down nanny in 3 counties. You watch. Come spring, there'll be a smell off that place you can ride home by." $6 and change. I told you I would make you watch it shrink. But here's the thing, the men in the feed store did not understand, because they had never been poor in a mountain country, never been the kind of poor where a goat is the difference between your children eating and not. They did not understand that a sick goat, properly tended, is a well goat. They did not understand that the very thing that made these animals worthless to everyone else, the fact that they were cast off and ailing, was exactly what put them within reach of a woman with $9 and a pair of clever hands and a mother in a Norwegian valley who had taught her how to read the inside of an animal's mouth. The men saw 11 dying goats. Greta saw 11 goats, most of which were merely sick. And sick is a thing you can mend if you know how, and almost nobody did. She mended them. Through that September and into the cold, she worked over those animals, the way a surgeon works. The orphan kids she fed by hand, 4 times a day and twice in the night, on milk from the 2 nannies that were in good flesh, warmed and given through a rag teat she sewed herself. The sick ones she dosed and poulticed and kept warm and clean and apart, so the trouble would not spread. She learned which brush on her hillside was good for a costive goat and which was good for a scoured one, learning it by watching them choose the way Saga had taught her. She lost 2 of the 11. She had expected to lose 3, and she lost 2. And the morning the second one died, she buried it herself in the stony ground above the spring and stood over it a moment, and then went back to the 9 that lived. 9 goats. By the first hard frost, she had 9 goats, and 7 of the 9 were nannies in milk or close to it, and Greta Halvorsen was, for the first time since her husband died, looking at something that was growing instead of shrinking. The milk surprised everyone who ever tasted it, which at first was nobody but Greta. Goat's milk in that country had a bad name, the way the goats did, because the few people who kept them dirty, kept the buck in with the nannies, so the milk took on a rank taint, never cooled it, never strained it. Greta did all of it right, because her mother had done it right. She kept her one buck, a rough black and tan creature she named Torsten, penned well away from the nannies, downwind, so the milk stayed sweet. She milked into a scalded pail. She strained the milk through clean linen and set it in the cold spring water at the foot of the red ledge to chill. And the milk that came out of that spring-cold setting was sweet and clean and white, with none of the goaty rankness the cattle people expected. And it made cheese. Oh, it made cheese. This is the part Greta's mother had really given her, and it is the part that would build the empire. So let me slow down and tell it right, because the comment section is going to want to know exactly how, and I want you to be able to tell them. In Norway, the poor families made a brown cheese, a whey cheese they cooked down for hours, until the milk sugars caramelized and turned the curd the color of dark honey, and gave it a sweet, almost fudgy taste, and it kept for months without spoiling, which, in a cold country with no money, was the whole point. They called it brunost, the brown cheese, and a wheel of it could feed a family through a winter and travel to market without going bad. Greta's mother had made it every autumn of Greta's childhood in a great iron kettle over a low fire, stirring it for half a day, and Greta had stirred it beside her since she was 6 years old, and her arms remembered the work even when the rest of her had tried to become an American wheat farmer's wife and forget. Let me stand you in the doorway of that soddy and let you watch her make it, because the comment section always wants to know exactly how, and because it is the single thing that turned milk into money, and money into a herd, and a herd into the thing that beat the buzzard. You start with the whey. Most cheesemakers throw the whey to the hogs, the thin greenish liquid left when the curd is taken out. But brown cheese is made of the whey, and that is the trick of it. That is why a poor country invented it. You waste nothing. Greta took the whey from her white cheese making, and to it she added fresh whole milk and a little cream, and she set the great iron kettle on a low fire of scrub oak coals. Low, never a hard boil, and she stirred and stirred. For 4 hours and more she stood over that kettle with the wooden paddle, never stopping, because if you stop the bottom, scorches and the whole batch is bitter and ruined, and slowly, slowly, the water cooked away, and the milk sugars in the whey began to brown, the way sugar browns in a pan, turning the curd from white to cream to gold to the deep red brown of dark honey, and the smell came up sweet and toasted and rich enough to make a hungry woman weep. When it was thick as wet clay, she beat it smooth so it would not grain, and she pressed it warm into a wooden mold, and she set it in the cold of the spring to firm, and the next morning she turned out a dark, dense loaf that would keep for months in a cool room and travel 100 miles in a wagon without spoiling, and that on a cold biscuit tasted like nothing else west of the ocean. She made her first wheel of brown cheese that October from the milk of 7 goats in that borrowed iron kettle over the fire of scrub oak wood, stirring it the whole short afternoon with the wooden paddle while the steam rose sweet around her face. And when it had cooled into a firm, dark loaf, she cut a corner and tasted it, and stood very still in the doorway of her soddy, with the late sun coming red off the sandstone ledge, and she tasted her mother's kitchen, and her dead mother, and the green valley, and the whole life she had left to come here and be a widow on bad land. And she did not cry this time. She wrapped the wheel in clean cloth and set it on the cool shelf, and she made another and another, because a thing you can taste, other people can taste, and a thing other people can taste, they will pay for. That was the whole of her plan that first autumn. Build a little herd of cast-off goats, mend them, milk them clean, make the brown cheese that kept and traveled and tasted like nothing else in the territory, sell it, live. It was a good plan. It was a true plan. And it nearly died, all of it, in the winter, because the frontier does not care how good your plan is. The frontier sends weather. The winter of 1884 into 85 came down out of the mountains in the first week of December, like the hand of God closing. The men who had been ranching that country for 10 years said afterward it was the worst they had seen. The snow came and did not stop, and then the cold came on top of the snow, a dry, killing cold that cracked the green wood in the fire and froze the spring at the foot of the red ledge, so that Greta had to break the ice with an axe twice a day to water her goats. She had 9 goats, and a soddy half dug into the hillside, and a lean-to she banked with snow for warmth, and she had, by the start of that winter, $4 left. $4. From 9 to 4. She had spent the rest on the only things you cannot make yourself out of a hillside: salt and lamp oil, and a sack of cornmeal, and a single precious sack of dried alfalfa hay she bought off a Mexican farmer named Reyes when she saw the winter coming, because brush does not feed a goat under 4 feet of snow. The hay ran out in January. I want you to sit in that with me for a moment, because this is the part that the men in the feed store would have paid money to watch. And it is the part Greta never talked about easily, even years later, when she could buy and sell every one of them. The hay ran out in January, and the snow was 4 feet on the level and drifted to the eaves on the north side, and the brush was buried, and she had 9 goats that would starve in a week if they did not eat, and she had no money to buy hay, even if a wagon could have got through, which it could not, because the road to Dry Fork was closed and would stay closed for 3 weeks. She did not have enough food for 9 goats. She did the arithmetic of it, standing in the freezing lean-to with her breath white in the lamplight. She had perhaps enough cut brush and scraps and cornmeal mash to keep 5 goats alive until a thaw. 5, not 9. And the cold mathematics of the frontier said you kept the 5 strongest and let the 4 weakest go, because 4 dead goats are better than 9 dead goats, and a dead farmer is no good to anyone. She stood there a long time. Then she went into the soddy and took down the wheels of brown cheese from the cool shelf, 11 wheels, the whole autumn's work, the things she had meant to sell in the spring to live on, and she carried them out to the lean-to, and she cut them up, and she fed her own winter's food and her own winter's money to her goats, mashed with the cornmeal and the last of the brush, because the cheese was milk, and milk is life, and she was not going to let 4 of them go. She kept all 9 alive. She ate cornmeal mush and melted snow for 3 weeks, and she gave the goats the cheese, and when the thaw finally came, in the first week of February and the road opened, Greta Halvorsen had 9 living goats and no cheese to sell and no money, and a body gone so thin her dress hung off her like a sail, and she walked into Dry Fork on the first clear day to see if Reyes had any hay left, and to see if she could trade work for cornmeal. And Cole Ander saw her come up the street and called out from the door of his freight office for the whole street to hear, "Still got your goats, widow, or did you eat 'em?" And Greta Halvorsen stopped in the middle of the frozen street and turned and looked at Cole Ander for the first time in 6 months, full in the face, and said, in her plain accented English, clear enough for the whole street, "I have 9 goats, Mr. Ander. In the spring I will have 20. You may write it down." And she turned and walked on to Reyes's place, and behind her the street was quiet, because nobody laughs the same at a starving woman who looks them in the eye and tells them the future like she has already seen it. Reyes had hay. Reyes, it turned out, was the one man in that country who did not think Greta Halvorsen was a fool, and the reason was simple. Reyes's people had kept goats in the mountains of Chihuahua, the way Greta's people had kept them in the mountains of Norway, and he knew exactly what she was doing, and he had been watching her do it all autumn with a quiet respect he never said out loud in front of the Anglos. I want to take you into Reyes's yard that first cold morning, because the men in the feed store are not the only people in this story, and the people who helped Greta deserve to be seen the way she saw them. Reyes lived in a low adobe house south of town, with his wife Dolores, and a yard full of children, and a dozen goats of his own, and rows of dried red chilies hanging under the eave. And when the thin, half-starved German widow walked up his road in February, with snow still on the benches, Reyes did not call out anything from a doorway. He came out into the yard, and he looked at how thin she was, and he looked at how she walked, steady, not begging, just walking, and he took off his hat to her, which was a thing nobody in Dry Fork had done in 6 months. "Señora Halverson," he said, "you kept the goats alive through the freeze." "All 9," Greta said. "I fed them my cheese." Reyes was quiet a moment. Then he said something in Spanish, low, to his wife in the doorway, and Dolores came out wiping her hands and looked at Greta and said something back. And then Dolores went inside and came out again with a bowl of frijoles and a stack of warm tortillas and put them in Greta's hands and would not take no, and Greta, who had eaten cornmeal mush and melted snow for 3 weeks, sat down on the bench against the warm adobe wall in the thin February sun and ate, and Reyes sat down beside her, and that was how the 2 families that the whole town looked down on became, that morning, allies for life. Reyes did not say much. He was not a man of speeches. But when Greta had eaten, he said, "You fed the goats your own food. A man here would have killed 4 to save 5. You fed them cheese." He shook his head slowly, and there was something in his face that was close to wonder. "My grandfather would have understood you, Señora. He kept goats in the Sierra when the Anglos there ran cattle and laughed at him, and he died with more in the bank than any of them. You and me, we know a thing they do not know. Brush is not worthless. Stone is not worthless. The animal nobody wants is not worthless. Come, let me show you my hay, and I will tell you which of your goats are the silk ones, because I think you have not understood yet what you are holding." He gave her hay on credit. He would not take her note for it. He said, "Pay me at the shearing," which puzzled her, because she had not said one word to anyone about shearing, about the other thing she had begun to see in her goats, the thing under the milk, the thing that would turn a dairy into an empire. Because here's what Greta had noticed that first winter, with her hands on her goats every day. Not all of them were the same. Most of her cast-off goats were common stock, short-haired milk and meat goats, the kind anybody kept. But 4 of the 11 she had started with, and now 3 of the 9 that lived, grew a different coat. Not hair, not the short, coarse hair of a common goat. These 3 grew a long, fine, curling white fleece, soft as anything she had ever touched, that hung down their sides in lustrous ringlets and shed snow like a roof, and kept the animals warm through that killing winter when the short-haired goats shivered. Greta did not have a name for it yet. She would learn the name later, but she knew silk when her fingers found it, and she knew, running her cold hand down the white curling fleece of a thin orphan goat in a frozen lean-to in January, that she was touching money. She did not know how much money. She could not have dreamed how much money. Let me just tell you the name of the thing now, so you are not in the dark the way she was. Those 3 goats were Angora goats, and the fleece they grew was mohair, and in 1885 mohair was worth, baled and shipped east, between 30 and 50 cents a pound at a time, when a good cattle hand earned $1 a day, and the United States imported nearly all of it from Turkey, because hardly anyone in America was raising the animals that grew it. Hardly anyone. But the dry, brushy, stony, sun-blasted, cattle-killing high country of western Colorado, the country everyone said was worthless, was very nearly perfect Angora country, because the Angora goat, like all goats, browses brush instead of grass, and climbs, and thrives on bad ground, and grows its best fleece in exactly the kind of dry, bright, cold-wintered climate that made cattlemen weep. Greta Halverson had stumbled, by way of $9 and a sick goat and a mother, in a Norwegian valley, into one of the few things that Badland was actually good for. And she had 3 of the animals that could do it. 3 Angora goats. Hold that number 2. Watch this one grow. She did not know any of the market figures that February. What she knew was that the white curling fleece was the finest thing she had ever felt, finer than the wool the sheepmen sheared, and that the 3 goats who grew it had come through the killing winter the strongest of the 9, and that whatever this was, she wanted more of it. She asked Reyes about the long-haired goats when she walked the hay home behind his old mule, and Reyes pushed back his hat and looked at her a long moment and said, "Those are the silk goats, Senora. Angora. My grandfather kept a few in Chihuahua. The Anglos think they are no good because they give less milk and less meat than a common goat. But the hair." He rubbed his fingers together. "In the cities, they pay for the hair. My grandfather sold the hair to a buyer who came twice a year, and it was worth more than all his cattle. Here, nobody knows. Nobody keeps them. You have 3? I have 3, Greta said. Keep the buck off your common nannies in the spring, Reyes said. Put him only to the 3 silk ones. Build the silk herd separate. In a few years, Senora, if God is good and the wolves are not, you will have something nobody in this country has." He looked at her, and a slow grin came up under his mustache. "And the men at the feed store will buy their hats from you." That was the first time anyone had said it out loud, the thing that was coming. And it came from a Mexican goat farmer that the whole town looked down on nearly as much as they looked down on the German widow, which is, I think, exactly right, because the people the frontier counted out were the only ones with the eyes to see it. I want to show you one more thing from that hard first winter before the spring comes on, because it is the night Greta nearly lost everything to a different enemy than weather or men, and she met it alone in the dark with a goat in her arms, and you should see it. It was late February, the snow rotten and gray and the nights still bitter, and Greta woke in the soddy past midnight to a sound she knew in her spine before her mind named it, the goats screaming. Not the ordinary fussing of penned animals, the high, tearing scream of an animal that smells death. She was out of bed and into her husband's old boots and out the door with the lantern and the single-barrel shotgun Aldous had left, all in the time it takes to tell it, and she came around the soddy into the lean-to fold to find the snow churned and a long gray shape low against the far rails, and one of her nannies down, and 3 more crowded screaming into the corner. A wolf, gaunt and desperate with the hard winter, had come down off the mountain and gotten in among the goats. Greta did not scream, and she did not run. She set the lantern on the rail where its light would carry, and she brought the shotgun up, and she could not fire into the press of her own animals, so she shouted low and hard and stamped, and the wolf turned its head, and its eyes caught the lantern flat and yellow, and for one held breath the woman and the wolf looked at each other across the churned snow with a dying nanny between them. Then the wolf came, because it was starving, and she was between it and the meat, and Greta Halverson stood her ground in her dead husband's boots and let it close to where she could not miss, and fired, and the gun bucked against her thin shoulder hard enough to drop her to one knee, and the wolf went down in the snow and kicked and was still. She did not feel brave. She felt sick. She knelt in the bloody snow a moment with her ears ringing and her shoulders screaming, and then she got up, because the nanny the wolf had pulled down was still alive, torn along the haunch but alive, and Greta carried that goat into the soddy by the fire and stitched the wound with the same darning needle she had used on Saga's jaw, sitting up the rest of that freezing night with the goat's head in her lap, talking to it low in Norwegian, and the goat lived. She lived, and threw twins that spring, and one of the twins grew the silk. In the morning, Greta skinned the wolf, because a wolf hide was worth $1.50 in town, and she did not have $1.50 to leave lying in the snow. And she sold the hide to the very feed store where the men had laughed at her, and she did not say one word about how she had gotten it, and let them wonder. And that was the winter. 9 goats in, 9 goats out, 1 wolf dead, 1 dairy herd surviving, and a woman who had learned that she could stand in the dark between her animals and death and not run, which is a thing worth more than any number of dollars, and which Harlan Voss, when he came in his fine buggy that summer, did not know he was up against. Now I have to tell you about the spring and the kid crop and the man who tried to take it all. But before the spring kids, I owe you a scene I have been holding, because the town's contempt was not only Cole Ander's loud mouth, and Greta did not only suffer it in silence. There was an afternoon late in that first winter when she had to go into the feed store herself for a sack of cornmeal she could not make on a hillside. And she went in, and there were 4 men around the stove, Cole Ander among them, and Asa Tillingham, who owned the store, and 2 ranch hands, and they did not stop talking when she came in. They got louder. "There she is," said one of the hands, not even quiet about it. "The goat woman, hey, missus, my horse took sick. You want to come collect him too, free of charge?" And the men laughed, and Asa Tillingham behind the counter smirked and let it go on, because Greta was a customer he did not respect, and the laughing men were his friends. And Greta Halverson stood at the counter with her chin up and waited for Tillingham to weigh out her cornmeal, and she did not rise to it, and that only made the hand bolder. Cat got her tongue. "Don't speak much American, does she? Just goat." And he bleated a long mocking bleat, and the men roared. Greta took her cornmeal and laid her coin on the counter, and then she turned, slow, and looked at the man who had bleated, a young loud-mouthed cowhand with his hat shoved back, and she said clear enough that the laughing stopped to hear her, "You laugh at goats. In Norway, where I am from, the goat fed my family on a mountain where your cattle would have starved in a week. The goat gave us milk and cheese and meat and the skin on our feet and asked for nothing but brush. I have watched your kind of man bring fine cattle to this country and watch them die in the snow and then come to the store and laugh at a woman whose animals are alive and fat." She picked up her sack. "When the hard winter comes, and it will come, you remember which of us laughed. Good day." And she walked out, and the silence she left behind her was a new kind of silence, and Cole Ander, years later, told people that was the first moment he ever wondered, just for a second, whether the German widow might know something they did not. He did not act on the wondering for 3 more years. But it started in that store, with a sack of cornmeal and a woman who would not be bleated at. Spring came late and wet that year, and Greta's nannies dropped their kids in April, and she had told Cole Ander she would have 20 goats, and she meant to keep her word. 7 nannies kidded. Goats often throw twins, and 5 of her 7 did, so out of 7 nannies she got 12 kids. And she lost only one, a weak twin that she could not save, though she fed it by hand through 2 nights and she buried it above the spring next to the 2 from the autumn, and went back to the 11 that lived. 9 grown goats and 11 kids. 20 goats. By the middle of May 1885, less than a year after she had led a dying animal down the main street of Dry Fork, while the men laughed, Greta Halverson had 20 goats, exactly as she had said, and 3 of the grown ones, and she could already see in the kids, several of the new young ones, grew the white curling silk. She walked into Dry Fork in May with a basket of fresh cheese and her chin up, and she stopped outside Cole Lander's freight office, and she waited until he came to the door, and she said, "20, Mr. Ander, as I told you." And she set one small wheel of brown cheese on the rail of his porch, not as a peace offering, but as a kind of receipt, and she walked on to sell the rest of the basket to Mrs. Pruitt at the boarding house, who had quietly become her best customer, because the brown cheese, it turned out, was magnificent on a cold biscuit, and the boarders asked for it by name. Let me show you one market morning from that summer, because the cheese did not sell itself, and Greta did not have a store. And the way she built her trade was the same patient way she built everything, one tasting biscuit at a time. Saturday was market day in Dry Fork. The wagons in from the outlying claims, the boardwalk crowded, and Greta would drive in with her basket and set up not in any stall, because she could not afford a stall, but on the tailgate of her own wagon at the end of the street, with a clean cloth laid over the boards, and the dark wheels of brown cheese cut into small samples on a tin plate, and a stack of cold biscuits she had baked at dawn. And she would not call out or hawk. She would simply stand by her wagon, straight-backed, and when a woman passed with a curious eye, Greta would say plainly, "Will you taste it? It costs you nothing," and put a sample on a biscuit and hand it up. And the woman would taste it, and her face would change the way every face changed, and that was the whole sale. Mrs. Pruitt of the boarding house was the first back in the spring, and Mrs. Pruitt had told the school teacher's wife, and the school teacher's wife had told the doctor's wife, and by midsummer Greta Halverson had a quiet line of the better women of Dry Fork who came to the end of the street on Saturday to buy the German widow's brown cheese, which had become, of all things, a little fashionable, a thing you served when company came, and the men outside the feed store watched their own wives carry home the dead goat's cheese and did not know what to make of it. I want you to hold one image. One Saturday, a rancher's wife, a hard, proud woman who had cut Greta on the street all spring, stopped at the wagon because her own children dragged her there, and tasted the cheese, and went very still, and then bought 2 whole wheels and counted out the coin without quite meeting Greta's eyes. And as she turned to go, she said, low, not quite an apology, "My mother made something like this in Sweden. I have not tasted it in 30 years." And Greta Halverson, who knew exactly what it was to taste your dead mother's kitchen in a strange, hard country, said only, "Then you will come back." And the woman did, every Saturday after, and that was how the wall came down, one biscuit at a time, years before the men ever took their hats off. The cheese sold. The herd grew. And success on the frontier is a smell that draws a particular kind of animal, and the animal it drew to Greta Halverson was named Harlan Voss. Harlan Voss owned the land office, and a good deal more than the land office. He was the man in Dry Fork who held the paper on half the failing claims in the county the man who lent money at a hard rate to homesteaders in a bad year and took their land when they could not pay, and he had been watching Greta Halverson's 40 acres with interest, not because of the goats, which he despised like everyone else, but because of the red sandstone ledge at the foot of her spring. Harlan Voss knew something about that ledge that Greta did not, and that almost nobody in Dry Fork did. And he had been waiting, patient as a buzzard, for the German widow to fail and lose the claim so that he could buy it cheap at the sheriff's sale and own the thing under the stone. He had expected her to fail in the winter. She had not. So in the summer of 1885, he came out to her place in a fine buggy to help her along. I want to stage this for you exactly because it is the turn of the whole story, and because it is the kind of scene the men in the feed store never got to see and would not have believed. It was a hot July afternoon. Greta was up on the brush bench above the soddy, mending the brush fence that kept her goats off Reyes's corn, when she saw the buggy come up her road, and she came down with the fence-mending hatchet still in her hand, and she met Harlan Voss in the yard with 20 goats watching from the pen and Saga. The first goat, now glossy and fat and insolent, standing on the chopping block where she liked to stand, surveying her domain. "Mrs. Halverson." Voss did not get down from the buggy. He looked down at her from it, which was the way he liked to talk to people. "I'll come straight to it. You've had a hard time out here, a widow, alone, this land. Nobody'd blame you for wanting to be shut of it. I'm prepared to buy your claim, $300, cash money today. You could go back east to your people and never break your back on this stone again." $300! To a woman who had been down to $4 in January, it was a fortune. Voss watched her face for the leap of it. Greta Halverson leaned the hatchet against the chopping block beside the goat and folded her hands in her apron, and she said, "Why?" "Why what?" "Why do you want this land, Mr. Voss? Everyone says it is worthless. You hold paper on better land than this all over the county. Why do you come 3 miles in the heat for 40 acres of stone that will not even grow wheat?" And Harlan Voss, who was clever, but not as clever as he believed, made his mistake. He smiled, the way a man smiles when he thinks he is talking to a fool, and he said, "Sentiment, Mrs. Halverson. I knew your late husband. I'd hate to see the claim go to ruin." And the lie was so smooth and so unnecessary that Greta knew, the way she had known a sick goat from a dying one, that there was something under the stone. "Thank you," she said. "I will keep my land." Voss's face changed. The buyer went out of it, and the creditor came in. "You're carrying a hay debt to that Mexican," he said, "and the territory's reassessing the tax on these claims this fall. You'll owe more than your cheese brings. When you can't pay, the claim comes up at the sheriff's sale, and I'll have it for half what I'm offering you now, and you'll have nothing. I'm being kind, woman. Take the 300. "I will keep my land," Greta said again, and she picked the hatchet back up, not as a threat, just because the fence still needed mending. And Harlan Voss looked at the hatchet and the goats and the thin, determined woman and the insolent goat on the chopping block, and he turned his buggy in the yard and drove off, and dust hung in the hot air behind him a long while after he was gone. Greta stood in the yard until the dust settled. Then she walked down to the red sandstone ledge at the foot of the spring, where the cold water came up, and she got down on her knees in the wet gravel, and she looked at the stone the way she had never bothered to look at it before, because she had only ever cared that it gave her water, and she did not know what she was looking for. But Harlan Voss had told her there was something to look for, and Greta Halverson was a woman who, once she knew a thing was there, would find it. She did not find it that day, but she found something else that day, and it is worth lingering on because it told her she was not the first to think this bad land was worth something. Down in the wet gravel, at the very foot of the red ledge, where the spring came up and the cold water had worn the stone smooth over long years, Greta's fingers, feeling along the rock for she knew not what, closed on a thing that was not stone. She worked it out of the gravel and washed it in the cold water and held it up, and it was a chisel, an old iron chisel, hand-forged, the kind a stone-cutter uses, rust-eaten and worn but unmistakable, lying where someone had dropped it long ago at the foot of the ledge. Somebody had worked this stone before her, somebody years back, before her husband ever filed the claim, had stood at this red ledge with a chisel and cut into it, and then had gone and left the tool, and the brush had grown over the cut marks she could now see, faint when she looked, square-edged scars in the sandstone where blocks had been taken out. Somebody had known the stone was good. Greta turned the old chisel in her hand and looked up the long red ledge and understood, in the cold morning, that she was standing on something men had wanted before and lost or left, and that Harlan Voss and his fine buggy was only the latest of them, and that the difference was she lived here, on it, every day, and it was hers, and she was not going anywhere. She kept the old chisel. She set it on the mantel of the stone house she built years later, and when people asked about it, she said it was the first thing she ever found that told her the land was worth more than the town believed, and she had found it the same week Harlan Voss tried to buy her out, which she always said with a small, dry smile. It would take her until the autumn to learn what the stone and the spring truly were, and when she learned it, it would not be what Harlan Voss thought it was, and it would be worth more than he ever dreamed, and the worth would come to her not through the stone at all, but through the goats, which is the kind of justice the frontier handed out maybe once in a generation. But I am getting ahead. Let me keep it in order. That summer, Greta sheared her 3 Angora goats for the first time, and learned what mohair was worth, and learned it the hard way, which was the only way the frontier taught. She did not know how to shear. She had milked goats all her life, but the silk goats were a new thing, and you do not shear an Angora the way you shear a sheep. The fleece is finer, and the animal more delicate, and the skin cuts easier, and a botched shearing ruins the fleece and can kill the goat. So she went to Reyes, and Reyes had sheared a few in his life, and he came over on a hot July morning and showed her on the first goat, the two of them kneeling over a thin, nervous Angora on a clean-swept board in the shade of the lean-to, Reyes's brown hands moving the hand shears slow and steady, talking her through it. "Slow, Senora. Against the lie of the wool, see? Lift and shear, lift and shear. Never twice in the same place, it shortens the hair, and they pay by the length. If she kicks, you stop. A cut on the skin spoils the fleece around it, and the flies will take her in this heat." And Greta watched, and then she took the shears herself and did the second side, slow, her tongue between her teeth, and the long white fleece peeled back off the goat in one curling sheet and dropped onto the board whole and clean, and Greta sat back on her heels with the fleece in her hands, and Reyes nodded once, which from Reyes was high praise. They sheared the 3 Angoras that day and got, all told, a little over 12 pounds of mohair, white and curling and shining in the July sun, and Greta held it in her 2 hands, and it weighed almost nothing. And Reyes said, "In Pueblo there is a buyer, a wool man. He buys mohair for the eastern mills. He will pay you for that. 12 pounds of mohair." She wrapped it clean, and she rode the next freight wagon to Pueblo, which cost her, and she found the wool buyer, a brisk Yankee named Foster, who ran a warehouse that smelled of lanolin and dust, and Foster ran the mohair through his fingers and looked at it sharp and said, "Where'd you get this?" "I raise it," Greta said. "In Colorado?" "In Colorado." Foster bought the 12 pounds at 42 cents a pound, which came to a little over $5, and to Greta that $5 was not the point. The point was Foster's face, and what Foster said as he counted it out. "Lady," he said, "I buy mohair from 3 men in this whole territory and from steamships out of Turkey, and the turkey hair has to cross an ocean to get here. The mills back east can't get enough of it. They make the plush for railroad seats out of it, and the lining of fine coats, and the upholstery in every parlor that wants to look rich. If you can raise this animal in this country, and raise it clean, like this is clean, you bring me every pound you can grow, and I will buy it. And the more you grow, the more I will pay, because I would rather buy from a wagon ride away than from across the sea. How many of these goats have you got?" "3, Greta said. "Soon more." "Get more," Foster said, which was the second time a sensible man had told her that, and she rode the freight wagon back to Dry Fork with $5 and change and a thing in her chest that was not quite hope, because hope was a soft word and what Greta felt was hard as the sandstone ledge. Certainty. She knew now what her bad land was for. It was for silk goats and every cast-off Angora in 3 counties, every one nobody wanted because it gave thin milk and stringy meat, was a treasure that the cattle country was throwing away, and Greta Halverson was the only person in 200 miles who knew it. So she did again what she had done with the dairy goats, but harder and faster, and with a purpose now that ran like a current under everything. She let the word go out at the back doors of the stockyards and along the freight road and through Reyes's people. The German widow would take any long-haired goat, any silk goat, any of the curling white kind, sick or sound, off your hands, and because nobody wanted them they came, the cast-off Angoras, 1s and 2s, from failing outfits and dead men's estates and ranchers who had bought a few as a novelty and given up. She paid pennies. She paid in cheese. By the autumn of 1885, she had brought her 3 silk goats up to 11, and they had thrown kids, and she had bred her 1 Angora buck, a rough little fellow named Vidar, only to the silk nannies to keep the line pure, and her dairy herd of common goats ran alongside making the cheese that paid for the salt and the hay and the tax. The tax. I have not forgotten the tax, and neither had Harlan Voss. The territory reassessed the claims that fall just as Voss had said, and the new tax on Greta's 40 acres came due in November, and it was $11, which does not sound like much until you remember that Greta Halverson lived in a world where $11 was nearly the whole of what her cheese had brought in across an entire summer of work, and she had spent most of that on hay against the coming winter, having learned her lesson the hard way in January. She had, when the tax notice came, a little over $6 to her name, and the wheels of cheese and a herd of goats she was not going to eat this time. $6 against an $11 tax. And Harlan Voss owned the land office, and Harlan Voss had told her exactly how this would go. She would come up short, the claim would go to the sheriff's sale, and he would buy it for the back taxes and own the stone. She rode to Pueblo again. She took every pound of mohair she had, sheared off the 11 silk goats that summer, which was now better than 40 pounds, because the new young Angoras had come into fleece, and she took the best of the brown cheese, and she sold the mohair to Foster, who paid her that time at 45 cents because the quality had come up. And the cheese she sold to a grocer in Pueblo who had never tasted anything like it and bought the lot. And she rode home with $19, and she walked into the land office in Dry Fork the day before the tax came due, and she counted $11 onto the counter in front of Harlan Voss in coin, and she looked at him while she did it. "My tax, Mr. Voss," she said, "paid. You will give me a receipt." The color went out of Harlan Voss's face and then came back up red. He had not believed she could do it. He wrote the receipt because the law made him, and his hand was not quite steady. And as Greta turned to go, he said low, so the clerk in the back would not hear, "You think you're clever. There's things under that land you don't know about, widow. I'll have it yet. I can wait." And Greta Halverson turned in the doorway with the receipt in her hand and the $8 she had left after the tax in her apron. More money than she had held since she came to that country. And she said, "Then I will find what is under it before you do. Good day." She went home, and she got down at the Red Ledge again, and this time she had a notion of what she was hunting, because Voss had now twice as good as told her there was something there. And a man like Voss did not want 40 acres of stone for the stone. He wanted what was in it. And the thing about the spring at the foot of the red sandstone ledge, the thing Greta had never thought about because she only cared that it gave water, was this: the water came up cold and clear, and it left on the rocks where it ran a faint pale crust, and it tasted, very faintly, of something. Not salt, something else. Bitter and clean. Greta did not know rocks, but she knew Reyes knew a man, an old Cornish miner named Trevelyan, who had come to the country chasing a silver and stayed to keep bees when the silver played out, a man who had spent 30 years reading stone. And she brought Trevelyan out to look at her ledge in exchange for 2 wheels of brown cheese and a winter's worth of goat tallow for his hands, and old Trevelyan got down at the spring with his clasp knife and scraped the pale crust and touched it to his tongue and went very still. "Where's this water come from?" he asked. "Up out of the ground here at the foot of the stone," Greta said. "It is the only water on the place. It never fails, even in the hard freeze." Trevelyan stood up slow, his old knees cracking, and he looked at the red ledge, and he looked at the long stony bench above it where the goats browsed the brush, and he looked back at the spring, and he said, "Missus, this here is a mineral spring. You taste that? That's a shallowbeat water, iron and salts. And that crust there is mineral come out of solution. Back in Cornwall and back east and in the old countries, folk pay good money to drink water like this and sit in it for their health. There's towns built on nothing but a spring like this one, Saratoga, Manitou, right here in this territory, growing fast as a weed because rich folk come from all over to take the waters." He scraped a little more crust and rubbed it between his fingers. "And I'll tell you another thing for your cheese. This stone." He laid his hand flat on the red sandstone. "This is good, clean building sandstone, and there's a sight of it. A man could quarry that and sell it for courthouses and banks all up and down this railroad. Your worthless 40 acres, missus, has got a healing spring and a stone quarry on it. And I bet my last comb of honey that lawyer in town knows it, because the railroad's coming through this valley inside 2 years, and a mineral spring on the railroad is worth more than a gold mine. And there it was, the buried secret under the red ledge that Harlan Voss had been circling like a buzzard. Not gold, not silver, water and stone. A mineral spring and a sandstone quarry on 40 acres that everyone in Dry Fork, including the dead husband who filed the claim, had called worthless, because they were all looking for the wrong kind of treasure. They were looking for what you dig up. Greta Halverson had spent 18 months learning to see the value in what everyone else threw away, and now the lesson came due in stone and water. But here is the thing, and this is the part I most want you to hear, because it is the whole soul of the story. Greta did not sell the spring. She did not turn around and build a spa town and get rich on the railroad, though she could have. And Harlan Voss spent 2 more years certain that was her game, and was wrong about that the way he was wrong about everything. Greta thought about the spring for one long night, sitting up by her fire with old Trevian's words going around in her head. $300, towns built on a spring, worth more than a gold mine. And in the morning she walked down to the red ledge, and she looked at the cold water coming up out of the stone, the water that had watered her goats through the killing winter when she broke the ice twice a day, the water that chilled her cheese sweet, the spring that had been the one reliable thing on the whole bad 40 acres. And she decided that the water's worth to her was that it watered the goats, and the stone's worth was that it sheltered them. And she was not going to tear up the one place on earth that was hers to make a rich man's bathhouse for people who would look down on her the way the whole town did. She would build her empire on the goats. The spring would water it. The stone would shelter it. And that, she understood, sitting at the red ledge in the cold morning, was the difference between her and Harlan Voss. And it was why she would win and he would lose. Harlan Voss wanted to own a thing and sell it. Greta Halverson wanted to make a thing and grow it. One of those is a buzzard, and one of those is a farmer. And the frontier in the long run belonged to the farmers. What she did do with the secret was quieter and cleverer. She had Trevian and Reyes as witnesses to what was on her land, and she had old Trevian help her file, properly and legally at the county seat, a notice of the mineral spring and the sandstone on her patented claim, so that the value was on the record and in her name, and Harlan Voss could never quietly take it at a sheriff's sale by pretending the land was worthless. She made the secret public. A secret is a thing a buzzard like Voss can use in the dark. A recorded fact in the light belongs to everyone, and most of all to the woman whose name is on the deed. The day the county clerk recorded that notice was the day Harlan Voss truly lost, though he did not know it yet. And it cost Greta nothing but a filing fee and a wagon ride and the nerve to walk into a county office full of men and put her name to the truth. Now, the empire, because all of this, the cheese and the spring and the stone and the buzzard, was the foundation, and the thing that rose on it was the thing the men in the feed store would finally have to look up at, hats in their hands, and I do not want to cheat you of one stone of it. Through 1886 and 1887, Greta Halverson built. She built the way she had mended the goats, one careful thing at a time, never borrowing more than she could carry, never selling the seed corn. The silk herd grew from 3 Angoras to 11, from 11 to 26, from 26 by the autumn of 87 to better than 70 head of pure Angora goats, the largest mohair flock between Pueblo and the Utah line, and the only one anybody had ever heard of being built by a woman out of cast-off animals on land a man had called worthless to her face. I want to take you to one shearing because the shearing was the heart of the year, and by 1887 it had become a thing, an event, the kind of gathering that knit a poor community together, and Greta ran it like the captain of a small, clean ship. Shearing came twice a year now, spring and fall, because the Angora's fleece grows fast and must be taken before it mats and felts on the animal. And on shearing day, Greta's stone yard filled with people. Reyes and his nephews to handle the goats, the 2 German girls to skirt and sort the fleeces, old Trevelyan to keep the tally board, Dolores and the children to feed everyone, and Greta herself moving through all of it, her sleeves rolled, her flaxen braid pinned up out of the way, calling the order of the work in her plain accented English with a word of Norwegian when she forgot herself. You do not shear an Angora the way you shear a sheep, and Greta had drilled it into every hand. The fleece is finer and the skin thinner, and a careless stroke cuts the goat, or near as bad, takes a second cut that shortens the fiber and drops the price. So the goats were sheared on a clean swept board, gently, one fleece off in a single piece, if you could manage it, and Greta would not let a man rush. "Slow hands," she would say, going down the line, "slow hands. The mill pays for length. A cut fiber is a half-price fiber. We do not give the mill our money for free." And the fleeces came off white and curling and lustrous, and were caught up by the German girls and laid out on the skirting table, where the dirty edges and the stained belly wool were skirted away and the clean fleece rolled and the whole thing weighed, and the weight chalked up on Trevelyan's tally board, pound by pound, while Greta watched the number climb. And here is a thing I love about her. At noon on shearing day she stopped the whole operation, every hand, and Dolores and the girls laid out a long table in the stone yard with frijoles and tortillas and Greta's own brown cheese and bread and coffee, and everyone sat down together and ate, the Mexicans and the Germans and the old Cornishmen and the children all at one table in a country and a time that did not generally seat such people together, and Greta sat at the head of it, because it was her yard and her goats and her name on the deed, and she fed everyone who worked for her until they could not eat more, and she paid in real coin at the day's end and never short. And that was why, when the bad day came and Harlan Voss dragged her to court, that whole table stood up and came to the courthouse and sat behind her. You build an empire one fed table at a time, the same as one tasting biscuit at a time, the same as one mended goat at a time. It is all the same slow, patient thing. The mohair clip grew with it. The first year, 12 pounds. The second, better than 40. By 1887, with 70 Angoras in full fleece-sheared spring and fall, Greta Halverson baled and shipped over 600 pounds of mohair to Foster in Pueblo in a single year, at prices that had climbed past 50 cents the pound as the Eastern mill's hunger grew, and as the quality of her clip became known, and Foster wrote her letters, actual letters, addressed to Mrs. G. Halverson, mohair grower, Dry Fork, Colorado, asking could she grow more, naming a mill in Massachusetts that wanted her whole clip under contract. 600 pounds at over 50 cents was better than $300 from the mohair alone in a single year off the silk goats. And that was on top of the cheese. Oh, the cheese. While the silk herd grew, the dairy herd grew alongside it, and the brown cheese that had once fed 9 goats through a killing winter became a thing people sent away for. Mrs. Pruitt's boarding house, and then the grocer in Pueblo, and then, when the railroad did come through the valley in 1887, exactly as old Trevelyan had foretold, the dining car of the railroad itself, which served Halverson brown cheese on the run from Pueblo to Grand Junction, and printed the name on its little menu card, so that travelers from Chicago and St. Louis tasted a Norwegian widow's brunost rolling through the Colorado mountains and asked the porter where they could buy it. Greta hired help, and the way she hired the first girl tells you who she had become. There was a German family named Brandt, failing on a claim north of town, the man dead of a horse fall, and the widow trying to feed 5 children on land as bad as Greta's had been, and the eldest girl, Annalisa, 16, walked the whole way to Greta's place one morning, and stood in the yard and said in German, because she had little English, that she had heard the goat woman paid in coin, and she could milk, and she could work, and she would do anything, please. And Greta Halverson, who had once been a thin, desperate widow herself, looked at the girl a long moment and saw exactly who she was looking at, and she said in German, the first German the girl had heard from a stranger since her father died, "Can you stir a kettle 4 hours and not let it scorch?" And the girl said, "Yes." And Greta said, "Then I will teach you the brown cheese, and you will send half your wage home to your mother, and you will eat at my table, and you will not be anyone's poor relation in this country. You will be a cheese maker, which is a trade. Wash your hands. We start now." And Annalisa Brandt wept right there in the yard, and then washed her hands, and became, in 3 years, as good a hand at the brown cheese as Greta herself, and married Cole Ander's son, and that is the thread that tied the whole street together in the end. She hired 2 of Reyes's nephews to herd, and Annalisa, and then her younger sister, to help with the milking and the cheese, and the soddy became a stone house built of her own red sandstone, quarried off her own ledge by a Cornish stonemason she paid in cash, and the lean-to, where a sick goat had spent its first night, became one wing of a long, clean dairy barn, with a milk house built right over the cold spring, so the milk chilled the moment it was strained, and every spring she still walked into Dry Fork with her chin up, and every spring the men outside the feed store had a little less to say. I told you there would be a falling counter, and I made you watch the dollars fall from 9 to 4, and I want you to see now where the counting turned around, because that is the hinge of every vindication story, and I will not summarize it for you. I will show you the day it turned, because it happened on a particular morning in front of particular men, and Greta Halverson earned every word of it. It was the spring of 1888. The railroad had come, and the town of Dry Fork had grown, and the country was full of cattlemen who had taken a beating in that same killing winter of 86 and 87, the great die-up that broke half the open-range cattle outfits in the West, the winter when the cattle that could only eat grass died by the tens of thousands under the snow, because grass does not grow under snow, and a steer cannot browse the brush a goat eats. Greta's goats had come through that winter fat, because brush sticks up out of the snow and a goat climbs to it, and because she fed her herd hay, she had bought with mohair money and stored against exactly such a winter, having learned her lesson in '84. with her own bones. The cattleman who had laughed at her goats spent the spring of '88 skinning frozen steers for the hide money and watching their mortgages come due, and Greta Halvorsen spent it shearing 70 fat Angoras and shipping 600 pounds of silk to the eastern mills. I summarized that great killing winter, and I should not have, because Greta lived it, and it is the winter that proved her whole method to the world. So let me put you back inside it. The snow began in November of 1886, and it did not let up, storm on storm, and then the cold clamped down behind the snow and held, week after week, the worst winter the open range cattle country ever saw, the one the cattlemen still called the Big Die-Up 50 years later. And out on the open range, the cattle, the fine beef cattle the ranchers had run by the thousand on free grass, began to die because a steer eats grass, and grass does not grow under 3 feet of snow, and a steer cannot reach what is buried. They drifted before the storms and piled up dead against the fences and froze standing in the coulees. And by spring, the carcasses lay so thick a man could have walked for miles on dead cattle, and outfits that had been worth a fortune in the fall were broke and skinning frozen hides for nickels by April. And up on Greta Halvorsen's worthless stony 40 acres, her goats were fat. I want you to see why, because it is the whole argument of her life made plain by weather. A goat is a browser. It eats up, not down. And brush, the scrub oak, and the chamiso, and the bitter woody growth that covered Greta's stony benches, brush sticks up out of the snow, and a goat climbs to it, climbs the drifts and the rocks, and reaches the twigs and the dried leaves the way it was built to do, so that the very snow that buried the cattlemen's grass and starved their cattle left Greta's goats a standing pantry of brush poking up everywhere out of the white. And on top of that, Greta had learned her lesson in '84 with her own bones, and she had spent her mohair money laying in a real store of hay this time, stacked dry in the new barn, enough to carry 70 head through any winter the mountains could throw. And she fed it out careful, and the goats came through that killing winter sleek and strong, and through a fine kid crop in the spring, while the whole valley around her was skinning dead steers. She walked into Dry Fork in the spring of 1887, into a town in mourning for its cattle, and nobody bleated at her. Nobody laughed. The men outside the feed store watched the German widow drive past with her good team and her fat goats, and her barn full of hay, and her mohair going east by the railroad that had just come in, and they did not say one word, because the winter had said it all for her. The thing she had told the loud cowhand in the cornmeal line 3 years before had come exactly true. The hard winter had come, and it had remembered which of them laughed. That spring, Cole Ander came to her. Stage it with me. It was a bright, cold morning in April, mud in the street, the new railroad depot gleaming with fresh paint at the end of town, and Greta had driven her own wagon in, a good wagon now, behind a good team, with the German girl beside her and the back full of cheese for the depot grocer. And as she pulled up, Cole Ander came across the street to her. Cole Ander, who had run the freight line that the railroad had just put half out of business. Cole Ander, who had called her dead goat dead, and asked her in a starving January if she had eaten her herd, and he came across the muddy street with his hat already in his hands, and Greta sat up on the wagon seat and looked down at him, which she had earned the right to do, and she waited. "Mrs. Halvorsen," Cole Ander said. He turned the hat in his hands. I'll say it plain because you never were one for soft soap, and I haven't earned soft soap from you anyhow. I've been a fool about you for 4 years, and the whole street's been a fool with me, and we were wrong. I came to ask if you'd take on hauling your mohair and your cheese to the depot and to Pueblo. My freight business is dying with the railroad in, and I've got good wagons and good teams and nothing to haul. And you've got more to ship than anybody in this valley. I'm asking you for the work, ma'am, and I'm sorry for the rest of it. The dead goat business, all of it, I'm sorry. There was a little crowd by now, the way there always is. Men come out of the feed store and the saloon to watch Cole Ander eat his hat in the street. And Greta Halverson let the moment sit just long enough. Not to be cruel. She was never cruel, but long enough that every man there understood exactly what they were watching. And then she did the thing that made the whole valley love her for the rest of her long life, the thing Harlan Voss would never have understood in 100 years. "Mr. Ander," she said, 4 years ago, you watched me lead a sick animal down this street, and you said, 'Give it a week.' Do you remember?" "I remember," Cole Ander said, and looked at his boots. "That goat is alive," Greta said. "Her name is Saga. She is fat and lazy, and she stands on my chopping block, and she has thrown me 8 kids, and her daughters fill my barn. You were wrong about the goat, and you were wrong about me, and I have heard about it from this street for 4 years." She paused. "And I have hay debts to settle and cheese to ship, and I cannot do it alone. Yes, Mr. Ander, I will hire your wagons. Be at my place Monday, and we will talk a fair rate. A man who can say out loud in the street that he was wrong is a man I can do business with, and there are not many of you." And she gathered the reins. But she was not quite done. She reached into the basket beside her on the seat and took out one small wheel of the brown cheese wrapped in clean cloth, and she handed it down to Cole Ander over the wagon wheel, and she said, "For your supper. It is goat's milk, Mr. Ander, from the dead goat." And a laugh went around the crowd, and it was, for the first time in 4 years, a laugh on her side, and Cole Ander laughed too, red to the ears, and took the cheese, and the thing was healed, because Greta Halverson had learned in a hard school that you can win without grinding a man's face in it, and that the winning lasts longer that way. That was the morning the counter turned all the way around. $9 to 4 to almost nothing, and now a herd of 70 silk goats, and a dairy with a railroad contract, and the man who had mocked her hauling her freight and eating her cheese, hat in hand. But the story's not quite over, because Harlan Voss is still out there, and a buzzard does not stop being a buzzard just because the rabbit got big. And I promised you a confrontation live in the back half, and here it is. Harlan Voss tried one last thing in the summer of 1888, and it was the desperate move of a cornered man, and Greta met it the way she met everything head-on in daylight in front of witnesses. The railroad coming through the valley wanted a watering stop and a depot, and the land office under Voss had the say in much of where the right-of-way ran and what land got bought up for railroad use. And Harlan Voss, who had never gotten over the 40 acres with the mineral spring slipping out of his hands, found a clerk's error or made one, an old technicality in the original homestead patent, the kind of paper crack a land lawyer can pry at, and he filed a claim that Aldous Halverson had not properly proved up the homestead before he died, that the patent was defective, that the land had reverted, and that therefore Greta Halverson had been living and grazing and quarrying and shipping mohair off public land she did not own, and that he, Harlan Voss, was prepared to file on it. It was a lie built on a sliver of truth, the way the worst lies are, and it landed Greta in the county courthouse in front of a judge in the high heat of August, 1888. 4 years almost to the day since she had led a sick goat down the main street of Dry Fork. I will stage this for you, because it is the last room, and Greta earned every word she said in it. The courtroom was full. Word had gone around. The German widow, who was no longer a joke, but had become something the whole valley took a strange pride in, was being dragged to court by Harlan Voss, who the whole valley had come slowly to despise, the way you come to despise the man who has held the paper on your bad years. Reyes was there, old Trevelyan was there, Cole Ander was there in a clean collar. Foster the wool buyer had come up from Pueblo, and Greta Halverson sat in a plain dark dress with her hands folded, and when the judge asked her if she had counsel, she said she did not, that a lawyer cost more than the truth ought to, and that she would speak for herself. And the judge, an old territorial judge named Brannigan, who had seen every kind of land grab there was, looked at her with the first interest he had shown all morning. Harlan Voss's lawyer made his case smooth and long. The patent was defective. The proven up was incomplete. The widow had no good title. The land should revert and be open to entry, and his client, a respected man of business, was first in line. He sat down, satisfied, and Greta Halverson stood up. "Your Honor," she said, in her plain accented English that 4 years of America had not smoothed and never would, "I am not a lawyer. I will tell you what I know, and you will decide. My husband, Aldous, filed this claim in the spring of 1883. He built the house, he dug the well, he broke the ground for wheat. He did the things the law asks a man to do to prove up a homestead, and he did them for the better part of a year. And then in the spring of 1884, he took a fever and died in 2 days, before the proving up was finished, and left me alone on the claim with $9 and a dry well and 40 acres of stone, everyone in this county called worthless. Mr. Voss will tell you that because my husband died before the paper was complete, the land is not mine." She paused, and she looked not at the judge, but at Harlan Voss. "For 4 years, Your Honor, I have lived on that land. I have watered my animals at its spring. I have broken its ice in the winter, and quarried its stone for my house, and buried 3 of my goats, and grieved my husband in its ground. I have paid its taxes every year in coin at that man's own land office, and he gave me the receipts, which I have here, because the law made him." She laid a small packet of receipts on the rail. "The law says a widow may complete her dead husband's homestead in his place. I have done the proving up that he did not live to finish. I have lived on this land and worked it and improved it for 4 years past his death, longer than the law requires, and I have paid every cent the territory has asked of me. Mr. Voss did not call my land worthless for 4 years out of kindness. He called it worthless because he wanted it cheap, and he wanted it cheap because he knew, before I did, that there is a mineral spring and a quarry of building stone under that red ledge, and he meant to take it at a sheriff's sale for the back taxes when I failed. I did not fail. So now he says the land was never mine at all." A sound went through the courtroom. Harlan Voss came half out of his chair, and his lawyer pulled him down. I filed a notice of that spring and that stone at this very courthouse 2 years ago," Greta said, "in the light, in my own name, with 2 witnesses, so that no man could ever take it from me in the dark by pretending it was worthless. It is on your records, Your Honor. You may send for it. I have nothing to hide and nothing buried. Everything I have I made out of animals nobody wanted, on land nobody wanted, with my own 2 hands, and I have paid my taxes and broken no law and harmed no soul, and I am asking this court only to let me keep the thing I built. That is all. I am finished." And she sat down. Old Judge Brannigan did not need long. He sent the clerk for the records, and the mineral notice was there, recorded and dated 2 years prior in Greta Halverson's name, just as she said. He sent for the tax rolls, and there were her payments every year in full. And he looked at Harlan Voss's defective patent claim, filed conveniently the same summer the railroad money came in, and Judge Brannigan, who had spent 20 years watching men like Voss pick the bones of widows and homesteaders, did a thing that the territory talked about for a long while after. "Mr. Voss," he said, "the law that lets a man prove up a dead man's homestead also lets that man's widow do it, and this woman has done it twice over. She has lived on this land and improved it and paid its taxes for 4 years, in the plain sight of this whole county, and she filed an honest public notice of its mineral value at a time when you, sir, were privately calling it worthless to her face. You knew its worth, and you concealed it, and you waited for her to fail, and when she would not fail, you came here with a paper crack and a hired tongue to take by law what you could not take by patience. This court finds the homestead duly proved, and the patent good, and the title vested in Greta Halverson free and clear, and I will entertain a motion from her, should she care to make one, regarding the costs you have put her to. Your claim is dismissed, and Mr. Voss." The old judge leaned forward. "I have been on this bench a long time, and I have watched a great many men try to get rich off other folks' bad luck. I have rarely had the pleasure of watching one of them lose to a woman and a herd of goats. Good day to you, sir." The courtroom did not cheer, because it was a courtroom, but Reyes wept openly, and old Trevelyan pounded his knee, and Cole Anders stood up in his clean collar with his face working, and Foster the wool buyer grinned like a boy, and Harlan Voss walked out of that courtroom into the August heat a finished man in that valley, because a man whose whole power is that people are afraid of his paper cannot survive the day the whole town watches a goat widow take his paper apart with the plain truth and her tax receipts. Greta Halverson did not file the motion for costs. She let Voss keep his money. She had learned somewhere in the 4 years that the cleanest victory is the one you do not have to keep collecting on, and that a man left whole but beaten will leave you alone, while a man ground to nothing has nothing left to lose and may do anything. Voss sold his interests within the year and left the valley, and Greta never spoke his name again, and when people brought it up, she would only say, "He taught me to read my own land. I owe him that much and no more," which was as close as Greta Halverson ever came to gloating, and it was closer than most. Let me give you the evening of that day, because you have earned it alongside her, and because I think the private moment tells you more about who she was than the courtroom ever could. She drove herself home from the courthouse alone. Reyes had offered to ride with her, and she had said no. She needed the air, and the truth was, she needed the silence, the way a person sometimes needs to be alone with a thing before it becomes real. The wagon road from town ran south, and after a mile the main road noise fell behind, and then there was only the creak of the wheels and the clip of a good team on the dry hardpack, and the mesas going red in the late afternoon light on either side of her, and Greta Halverson sat up on the seat with the reins loose in her hands and let herself feel it, 4 years of it, all at once, which she had not allowed herself to do while it was still in question. The $9, the sick goat, the wolf in the snow, the cornmeal winter, the tax, the buzzing in her ears in the land office when she had counted $11 onto Harlan Voss's counter, the chisel in the gravel, the first wheel of cheese, the 12 pounds of white silk on Foster's scale. All of it laid end to end in the long quiet of the road, and she let it be what it was, which was her life, and it was a good life, and she had built it herself, and nobody could take it. When she came over the last rise and saw her own place below her in the evening light, the red sandstone house solid as the ledge it had been quarried from, the long white barn with the milk house roof catching the last sun, the fold where the silk goats moved like slow white clouds in the dusk, and at the near corner of the fold, fat and insolent on the chopping block, as she always was at this hour, Saga, the first goat, now 6 years old and gray around the muzzle and heavy with another spring's kids. Greta pulled up her team and sat still a moment and looked at it all. "There," she said to no one, the same word she had said in a lean-to over a sick goat with a thorn in its jaw. "There, you lived." And she did not know if she meant the goat or herself, and she supposed it did not matter, because both were true. She unhitched the team and watered them at the trough, and fed the silk herd their evening browse, and milked the dairy nannies in the stone-floored milk-room by the light of a clean lamp, alone, the way she had done 1,000 times before, the warm jets hitting the cold pail, the smell of fresh milk and clean straw around her, and she could hear the spring running under the milk-room floor, the cold, faithful water that had never quit on her. And when she was done, she sat a moment on the milking stool in the lamplight, listening to it, and she thought that if she died that night, she would have nothing to complain of, which is a rare thought for a woman of 30, and as good a measure of a life as any. She did not die that night. She lived, as I told you, a long time, and the years that followed the courthouse were the building years, the full flowering of everything she had planted in that first hard season, and it was good, and I want to show it to you not as a summary, but as a thing with warmth and texture, because that is the only way a life rings true. Now let me bring it home, because a vindication is no good if you do not get to sit by the warm fire at the end of it, and Greta earned the warm fire. By 1890, 6 years after the sick goat, Greta Halverson's outfit was the largest goat operation on the western slope of Colorado, and one of the largest mohair growers in the United States, which is a smaller thing than it sounds, because America barely raised mohair then, and a larger thing than it sounds, because it meant that the curling silk fleece off the bad land south of Dry Fork went east by railroad to mills in Massachusetts, and came back as the plush on the railroad seats that ran past her own door, so that a traveler riding through the Colorado mountains sat on the very thing the German widow's goats had grown and ate her brown cheese off the dining car menu, and never knew that the whole of it had started with one sick animal and $9, and a woman everyone said would not last a season. She had a stone house built of her own red sandstone, with deep, cool rooms and a porch that looked west to the mesas, and a long white dairy barn over the cold spring, and a separate clean fold for the silk goats. And Reyes was her foreman, and his nephews her herders, and the German girls who had come off failing farms to help her milk had become, some of them, Neera's daughters, and one of them married Cole Ander's son, so that the two families that had started that street 4 years of grief were joined in the end, which is the kind of thing that happens in a country small enough that everyone has to forgive everyone eventually, or there is no one left to dance with. I want to take you to one morning in the early 1890s, because there came a man all the way from Massachusetts on the train, a mill buyer named Whitmore, who represented one of the big textile firms in Lowell that had been buying Greta's mohair baled through Foster. And Whitmore had decided he needed to see the operation himself before he wrote the contract he was prepared to offer. A 3-year supply agreement at a locked price that was more money than Greta had held in her life at one time. He came off the train at Dry Fork in a city suit and a hard hat, and Cole Ander met him at the depot and drove him out. And Whitmore did not say much on the road, looking at the red mesas and the sage and the dry country, looking, Greta would tell people afterward, like a man wondering how anything of use could come from such a place. She was in the shearing yard when they drove up, rolling a fleece with Reyes's oldest nephew, and she did not stop for the buggy. She finished rolling the fleece and handed it to the boy and chalked the weight on the tally board herself. And then she turned, still in her work apron, with her sleeves rolled and lanolin on her hands, and she looked at the city man in his suit standing at the gate of her stone yard. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "you came a long way." "I did," said Whitmore, and he looked at the fold of white angoras and the stone house and the long barn and the milk house over the spring, and then he looked at her, a lean, fair-haired woman of 30-odd in a work apron who had just rolled a fleece like a man born to it, and something shifted in his city face. "This is your operation," he said, not quite a question. "It is mine," she said. "Come and see it." She took him through all of it. The fold, where 110 angoras moved in the sun, their long curling fleeces catching the light. The shearing board, where she showed him the difference between a first-cuts fleece and a clean once-over, and let him run the white silk through his own city fingers. The wool room, where the bales were stacked tight and labeled in her own hand weight and clip date and the grade she assigned each batch, which Whitmore said was more consistent grading than he got from operations 3 times the size. The milk room over the cold spring, where the brown cheese wheels sat on their cool shelves, aging in the dark, and where the spring water ran clear and cold under the stone floor. And then the porch of the stone house, where she sat him down and gave him coffee and a plate of the brown cheese on bread, and let the country speak. Whitmore sat a long time on that porch after he ate, looking out at the red mesas and the white goats and the long barn. Then he said, "You built all of this." "I did," she said, "from nothing. From $9 and a sick goat," she said, "and land everyone called worthless." Whitmore was quiet again. Then he pulled out his contract and laid it on the table between them. 3 years at a price per pound that made the paper tremble a little in the morning wind, and he said, "Mrs. Halverson, in 30 years of buying wool and mohair, I have not once come all the way to the source before I signed. I came this time because Foster wrote me that you were unlike anything he had seen, and I find that Foster understated the case. The mills want all you can grow. Name your price, and I will take it back to Lowell, and I think they will say yes. He tapped the contract. A woman who can build this out of a sick goat and $9 on worthless land in the middle of nowhere can name her price. I mean that without flattery. And Greta Halverson, who had sold her first 12 pounds of mohair to Foster for $5 and change and thought that was the point of the matter, picked up the contract and read it through, all of it, because she had learned to read the fine print of things from the man who had tried to take her land with a paper crack and a hired tongue, and when she had read it, she set it down and named her price, which was higher than Whitmore's figure. And Whitmore looked at her a moment and then said, "Done." And they shook hands over the cold spring coffee on the red sandstone porch. And the mill contract that began that morning ran with renewals for the better part of 20 years, and Greta's Angoras in their fold south of Dry Fork supplied the plush for railroad seats and parlor furniture from Boston to St. Louis, and the name Halverson went east on every bale. And the spring. She never sold the spring. When the railroad men and then, a few years later, the spa promoters came around offering real money for the mineral water, offering to build a hotel and a bathhouse and put Dry Fork on the map as a health resort the way Manitou Springs had been put on the map, Greta listened politely and gave them cheese and turned them down, everyone because the spring watered her goats and chilled her cheese and broke the killing winters, and it had been the one faithful thing on the bad 40 acres in the worst year of her life, and she was not going to dig it up and sell it to people who would have crossed the street to avoid her in 1884. The spring stayed hers, and the goats drank from it, and that, to Greta Halverson, was wealth. And the spa men who could not understand her were the same kind of men as Harlan Voss, and she had taken their measure long ago at the Red Ledge in a cold morning and found them wanting. There was the railroad, too, and I promised you old Trevelyan's prophecy come true, so let me give you the morning it did. The grading crews came through the valley in the spring of 1887, and the rails followed in the summer, and the first train to run the new line from Pueblo to Grand Junction came through on a bright morning with the whole of Dry Fork lined along the new depot to see it, and Greta Halverson stood there too, in a good dress now, with the German girls and Reyes's children around her, and watched the engine come down the valley trailing smoke against the red mesas. And a railroad man, a dining car steward in a white coat, had heard about the brown cheese from a grocer in Pueblo, and he came down the platform asking for the Halverson woman, and found her, and asked could the railroad buy her cheese for the dining car, regular by contract, to serve to the passengers on the mountain run. And Greta, who 4 years before had fed that very cheese to 9 starving goats in a frozen lean-to to keep them alive, stood on the new depot platform and shook a railroad man's hand and said yes, she could supply them, and named a fair price, and did not let her voice shake, though Reyes told Dolores that night that he had seen the German widow's eyes go bright and wet for just a moment before she made them stop. And so it was that the plush on the railroad seats was her goat's silk, and the cheese on the dining car plate was her goat's milk, and the whole train, rolling through the mountains, was carrying the proof of her, and she had built every bit of it out of what the world threw away. She lived a long time. She never remarried, though she had her chances. The watching rancher who had doubted her, a quiet, decent man named Pell who ran cattle on the next section and had been the only one of the big men who never laughed, courted her gently for 2 years. I will give you one moment of it, because Greta deserved a little warmth, and so do you. Pell came to her stone house porch one autumn evening with his hat in his hands, the way men did with her now, and he stood a while and finally said, "Greta, I'm no good at this, and you'll have heard better said, but I've watched you 4 years build this out of nothing, and I never once laughed, and I'd be proud past saying to stand beside it and you if you'd have me. I won't ask you to be less than what you made yourself. I'd just like to be near it." And Greta Halverson, who had buried one husband on that land and built the rest of it alone, looked at the good quiet man a long moment, and was tempted, and was fond of him, and in the end shook her head slow and said, "You are a good man, Mr. Pell, the best in this valley, and I will not lie and say I am not moved. But I buried Aldous out by the spring, and I built everything since with these 2 hands alone, and I have found, God help me, that I like the building alone. I do not think I am a wife any more. I think I am only a farmer now." And Pell nodded, because he had half expected it, and he said, "Then I'll be your neighbor and your friend, and I'll come to the shearing." And he did, every year, to the end of both their lives, and that was its own kind of warmth, the kind that does not need a wedding to be true. She was a fixture in that country for 40 years, the goat lady, the German widow who built an empire out of cast-off animals. And when the young women came to her, as they did, the ones who had been widowed or thrown over or laughed out of town, the ones with nothing but bad land and a hard idea, she took them in and showed them the goats and told them the one thing she had learned that was worth telling. I will tell it to you the way she told it, because it is the end of the story and the reason I wanted to tell it to you at all. A young woman came to her once, years on, a widow like Greta had been, with a worthless claim and no money, and the whole town laughing, and the young woman stood in Greta's stone house parlor and cried and said she did not know what to do. The land was no good. Everyone said so. Everyone said she would not last a season. And Greta Halverson, old now, with silver hair and strong hands that still smelled of lanolin, took the young woman out to the fold where the silk goats curled white in the sun, and she put the young woman's hand on the fleece, and she said, "Everyone told me my land was worthless. They were right, for the thing they wanted to do with it. They wanted to grow wheat, and you cannot grow wheat on stone. But the land was never worthless. It was only worthless to people who would not change what they wanted. The stone that starves a cow feeds a goat. The brush nobody could use, the goat turns into silk. The animal nobody wanted, you mend, and it builds you a house. The whole world will tell you what is worthless, child, and the whole world will be wrong, because the whole world is too lazy to look twice. You look twice. You look at the bad land and the sick animal and the thing they threw away, and you ask not what is wrong with it, but what is it good for? And then you do the slow, hard work of being right while they laugh. And one morning the man who laughed will come across the street with his hat in his hands. I have seen it. I made it happen. It started with a sick goat I got for nothing, because a man did not want to dig a hole. And on the mantel of that stone house all those years sat two things side by side that told the whole story to anyone who knew how to read them. The old rusted stone-cutter's chisel she had pulled from the gravel at the foot of the red ledge the same week Harlan Voss came to buy her out, and beside it a single small framed lock of white curling mohair, the first fleece, the 12 pounds she had carried to Pueblo on a freight wagon and sold to Foster for $5 and change, the chisel for the land everyone called worthless, the silk for the animals everyone threw away. A young woman who came to see her once asked what they were, the rusty iron and the bit of white wool under glass, an odd pair to keep on a rich woman's mantle, and Greta said, "Those are my deed and my title, child. The town gave me a paper deed to 40 acres of stone. These two things are the real deed. One says the land was never worthless. The other says the animals never were. I keep them where I can see them every morning, so I never forget that the whole world was wrong and a thin widow with $9 was right, and that the difference between them was only that she was willing to look twice." And she would laugh, the old woman, out at the goats in the sun. $9, she would say. I came here with $9 in a dead man's bad land, and they all said 1 season, 1 season. And she would shake her silver head and look out over the red mesas and the white goats and the stone house and the long barn over the cold spring, all of it hers, all of it made, and she would say the thing that ought to be carved over the door of every house where somebody was ever counted out, and proved them wrong. "I lasted," Greta Halverson would say. "I lasted, and I built, and the goat that was supposed to die outlived the man who laughed at her." Let that be the lesson. Mend what they throw away. It is almost always the most valuable thing in the country, and you can have it for nothing because nobody else can see. That is the story of Greta Halverson and the sick goat that built an empire, and it is true in the way the best frontier stories are true, true in its bones if not in every name, because there really were women like her in that hard, bright country, women who looked at worthless land and sick animals and saw what the loud men could not, and built something lasting out of what the world threw away. There really was a mohair boom in the dry American West in those years, and the goats really did thrive on the brush that starved the cattle, and the great die-up of the winter of 1886 really did break the cattlemen who had laughed at every other way of working the land, and there really were brown cheese-making widows from the cold countries, and mineral springs under red ledges, and buzzards in land offices, and judges who now and then did the right thing. If you stayed with me all the way to the warm fire at the end, thank you. Truly, do that small kindness I asked you at the start, if you have not. Give this a like, so the next person who needs to hear about a sick goat and a worthless 40 acres finds their way here, and tell me in the comments what city or town you're watching from. And tell me, too, if you would, whether you have ever in your own life mended a thing the world threw away and watched it turn out to be the most valuable thing you had. I read every comment. I will be looking for yours. And the next time someone tells you that your land is worthless, or your idea is foolish, or your sick goat is as good as dead, you remember Greta Halverson, 23 years old and $9 to her name, leading a dying animal down a dusty street while the whole town laughed, and you remember what that goat became, and you go on. You do not turn your head. You just go on, and you do the slow, hard work of being right, and you wait for the morning the man comes across the street with his hat in his hands. He always comes. It just takes a season longer than the laughing. Take care of yourselves out there. Mend what they throw away, and I will see you in the next one.